public session. In Part A of today's meeting, we meet in public session with representatives of the Reserve Defence Forces Representative Association, Neil Richardson, General Secretary, Eugene Gargan, Chairperson, and John Leahy, Member of the National Executive Committee. You are all very welcome to the meeting this morning. The format of the meeting is that we will hear your opening statement before going into a question and answer session with the members of the committee. Before we begin, may I remind members, witnesses and those in the public gallery to ensure that their mobile phones are switched off completely for the duration of the meeting, as to cause interference even on silent mode with the recording and broadcast equipment in the committee room. So all mobile phones to be turned off. Also, I remind members of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person or body outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. By virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act of 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the Joint Committee. If they are directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, they are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of their evidence. They are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and they are asked to respect the parliamentary practice that, where possible, they should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I now call on Neil to make his opening remarks.
Mr. Chairperson, thank you. Deputies, Senators, thank you. During RDFRA's last appearance in November 2015 before the then Joint Committee on Justice, Defence and Equality, we spoke about various issues facing the Reserve Defence Forces at that time. The Association was keen to work openly, supportively and closely with the military authorities and the Department of Defence toward a resolution to all issues. At the time, the 2015 White Paper on Defence had just been published, and it was RDFRA's intention to fully support the implementation of this document, and so we actively endorsed and promoted the White Paper to our members. All in all, we expected 2016 to be a positive and growth-filled year for the Reserve, but sadly, the result was exactly the opposite. In terms of recruitment, generally the main concern on the lips of every reservist, there were 341 new recruits who joined the organisation in 2015, a welcome increase of 184 on the previous year's figure of 157. However, by the end of October 2016, only 47 new recruits had been trained by the Reserve since the start of the year. The military authorities hoped that the figure might reach between 80 and 100 by the end of the year. It ended up being somewhere in the region of 60. Recruitment is the lifeblood of the Reserve, and without a steady flow of new recruits, the organisation is doomed to erode away to nothing. During our November 2015 open address to the Joint Committee, I personally stated that, and I quote, "This year, recruitment competitions yielded an increase of just over 300 new members, but retirements due to natural wastage resulted in a loss of over 200 other personnel. Overall, this produced a net gain of approximately 100 new members, and if this rate of increase were to continue year on year into the future, it will be 2030 before the Reserve will have recruited up to its establishment." End quote. Within weeks of saying this, we could have revised this statement to point out that retirements were now outstripping recruitment, and while the Reserve had 2,280 effective members at the end of 2015, this had reduced to 2,049 by the end of 2016. Most tellingly, application figures actually increased from 2014 onwards. In 2014, the Reserve received 4,870 applications to join, while between September 2015 and December 2016, a period during which there was an administrative pause on Reserve recruitment for several months to allow for PDF recruitment competition, the Reserve received 5,891 applications to join. So somehow, while the 4,870 applications received in 2014 resulted in 341 new recruits in 2015, the 5,891 applications from the next round of recruiting resulted in approximately only 60 recruits. For some reason in 2016, the ability of the Defence Forces to induct new reservists plummeted. The problem partially stems from the overburdening of permanent Defence Forces staff in various offices that deal with recruitment. These offices are staffed by only a handful of personnel at best and are responsible for permanent and reserve recruitment along with a host of other tasks. Anything to do with the Reserve is often given the lowest priority, meaning that vital Reserve administration is often attended to only months after a due date, resulting in endless delays that see some Reserve applicants waiting over 18 months to undergo the required tests to join the Reserve. The other half of the problem is the unwillingness of some permanent Defence Forces personnel to support Reserve recruitment endeavours. So while many are genuinely seeking to do their jobs and support the Reserve but are completely snowed under, others simply view the Reserve as not a real part of the Defence Forces and so therefore absolutely not really important in the grand scheme of things. It must be noted that when members of the Permanent Defence Forces act in such a way toward the Reserve, they rarely, if ever, are reprimanded by higher military authority. In essence, an insidious culture of discrimination is allowed to go unchecked. Either way, the negative handling of reserve recruitment has the same effect. The goodwill and enthusiasm of many reserve applicants is utterly destroyed, producing in them a lasting and unfairly negative opinion of the reserve, while the reserve itself gets smaller and smaller, despite the thousands of young Irish men and women looking to join each year. Based on current trends, our association's previous prediction that the reserve would not recruit up to establishment strength until 2030 has proved to be grossly optimistic. Now, if the net loss of 200 members that the reserve experienced last year continues on into the future, the reserve will cease to exist by 2026. with it likely being seen as impractical to sustain long before that. We would like to strongly re-emphasise that this is not due to a lack of interest from people looking to join and improve both themselves and their communities via reserve military service to the state, but rather it is due to the lack of importance with which the reserve is viewed by elements within the Defence Forces and the Department of Defence. Sadly, recruitment is not the only area in which the reserve is mishandled and mistreated. The Association has been fighting the case for improvements to the personal protective equipment, also known as PPE, supplied to the reserve for years. Unlike with members of the Permanent Defence Forces, reservists do not obtain a personal issue of many items of PPE. Instead, reserve units pool this equipment for use by various individuals when required. With regards to other items of PPE, most notably cold weather clothing, reservists do not receive any meaningful items of this type at all. In terms of the pooled items, this equipment is regularly returned to storerooms in a heavily soiled state, only to be stored in this condition for weeks or months before being handed out to a different reservist in the future. And I would like to invite the committee to imagine what a mould-covered, sweat-soaked helmet or a mud and sheep faeces-covered wetsuit looks like when it is removed from a warm storeroom after several months of storage. Furthermore, we wish to point out that the reservists who assisted with flood relief efforts around the country during the winter of 2015 and 16 did so almost exclusively with items of warm clothing that they had purchased themselves, because the Defence Forces does not issue them with any such clothing beyond a thin Norwegian top that is hardly sufficient for minus temperatures. In order to combat this health and safety disaster waiting to happen in relation to the pooled equipment, RDFRA had several meetings with senior military management, and it was agreed that regulations on the correct cleaning of pooled PPE would be drafted and widely circulated to Defence Forces logistics personnel. Despite receiving multiple assurances that this would be done, logistics personnel in storerooms around the country are still unaware of this directive. In contrast, when an issue arose over whether reserve officers would be permitted to continue wearing a peaked cap with their dress uniform, which was an item of clothing normally worn by permanent officers only, the relevant regulations were speedily amended to prohibit the wearing of this item of clothing by reserve officers, and this instruction was widely and effectively circulated to ensure compliance. This example only proves that certain echelons of the Defence Forces care less about the correct provision of PPE for reservists and more about trivialities such as making sure that reserve officers cannot be mistaken for permanent officers when wearing their dress uniforms. This example also proves that the mechanisms to make changes clearly exist but are not being utilised for the benefit of reservists. Similarly, RDFRA have continually requested that necessary amendments be made to other Defence Forces regulations governing the reserve, most notably R5 and S7, only to be informed month after month and year after year that these regulations are still currently in the process of being examined. However, as the peaked cap issue shows, it seems that when there is a will for reserve regulatory reform, it can happen very quickly. Back in 2015, RDFRA argued that the end-of-year gratuity, which was taken from members following the 2012 Value for Money report, should be reintroduced, both to incentivise new members to join and also to help offset the often substantial costs incurred by members during their annual service. It should be remembered that reservists undertake their duties in a predominantly voluntary, unpaid capacity, and due to past barrack closures, they now have to travel considerable distances to reach their new training centres. A return gratuity would at least make serving in the reserve more cost-neutral than it currently is. However, now we find ourselves faced with an extremely blasé attitude emanating from the Defence Forces and the Department of Defence towards normal reserve pay, i.e. the pay that reservists receive for undertaking short blocks of full-time training each year. One of the most frequent issues raised by reservists with RDFRA pertains to late payments. One of the Defence Force's own internal documents, Army Financial Circular 297, states that a reservist must be paid on the Friday of the week in which they have undertaken paid full-time training. Despite this clear instruction, reservists frequently only receive their pay after a number of weeks' delay. Sometimes the delay is one of several months' duration. In early 2017, RDFRA even dealt with one case where a member was still awaiting pay dating back to December 2015. Whenever these issues are raised by RDFRA, the response is generally that maladministration in the reservists' unit is the cause, as if explaining the cause of the problem is somehow the same as fixing it. Put simply, when reservists receive pay, it is regularly treated as though it were an income supplement or a bonus of some sort, i.e. monies that a reservist is receiving on top of their civilian wage and therefore monies that they do not really require as a matter of urgency. This is an outrageous and inaccurate view. In fact, many reservists take unpaid leave from work to attend periods of reserve full-time training, and so their reserve pay is actually an income replacement for that period, not a supplement. Furthermore, there have been tragic cases of reservists in receipt of social welfare payments who have signed off from their welfare in order to undertake paid periods of reserve full-time training, only to be told in the middle of the training week that the paperwork to pay them has not been processed, and so they will receive their reserve pay at some undefined time in the future. Subsequently, their attendance at that period of reserve full-time training does not carry with it a social contribution, as they received neither a welfare payment nor reserve pay during that week. But worst of all, thanks to their decision to undertake military service to the state for that period, they are left without any source of income for that period. This was the situation that several reservists found themselves in the weeks preceding Christmas last year. Furthermore, if late payments are finally paid to a reservist in a subsequent calendar year, this adversely affects their annual tax credits. But no matter how often these concerns are raised, there seems to be either an inability or an unwillingness to seriously address and remedy the problems. I invite the committee to imagine what might happen in any government department or private sector business if employees were informed that their pay each week would arrive at some point in the future, but that no one could say when for sure. We have no recourse to the industrial relations mechanisms of the state, such as the Workplace Relations Commission, to formally address this issue, and without official reprimand or rebuke, there is little prospect of any meaningful changes or improvements to this issue. Ultimately, RDFRA believes that the constant river of obstacles faced by the Reserve stems from a culture within the Department of Defence and elements within the military authorities who simply could not care less about the Reserve Defence Forces. This has been allowed to flourish unchecked by your or the public scrutiny. In terms of the Department of Defence, its level of engagement with RDFRA, and particularly in relation to the implementation of the 2015 White Paper on Defence, has been deeply troubling. RDFRA and the Reserve are considered only as an afterthought. RDFRA delegations have arrived at White Paper Joint Implementation Team briefings to be provided with documents that had been circulated amongst other key stakeholders well in advance of the meeting, but which RDFRA had not received. Queries raised and requests made by RDFRA go unanswered, while all attempts by RDFRA to engage further in the White Paper implementation process are either rejected or ignored. For example, when questioned about the number of reservists sitting on the 12 reserve-relevant projects arising from the White Paper, a member of the White Paper Joint Implementation Team had to think hard about how many reservists were actually sitting on these project teams. They knew of one, possibly two. It is hard to imagine that key stakeholders would not be centrally and widely involved in the various White Paper project teams, but when it comes to the 12 projects linked to the Reserve, there are only 2 reservists permitted to be involved. RDFRA have continually recommended known subject matter experts within the Reserve, one of whom has conducted considerable academic research on the Reserve, to the Department of Defence in the hopes that these experts will be utilised as part of the White Paper project teams. Again, all recommendations made by RDFRA have been ignored. This leads us to the inevitable conclusion that the Department of Defence has an agenda and a desired outcome for the Reserve, and neither RDFRA nor any qualified reservists will have the opportunity to influence that goal in any way. To be blunt, the effect of this latent policy is to run the remains of the Reserve into the ground for their own reasons, reasons which we believe run counter to the stated policy of this and previous governments. In relation to the level of engagement experienced by RDFRA from the military authorities, this is overall somewhat more positive. Most issues arise from individuals who are not adhering to Defence Forces policy, or from specific offices where reserve matters fall through the cracks, either on purpose or due to overburdened staff. Meanwhile, on the whole, the general staff are positively disposed towards the Reserve. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said to be true with the Naval Service Reserve. Once the Naval Service Reserve was the shining light of the Reserve, and at points in the recent past, Naval Service vessels would not have been able to put to sea if it were not for members of the Naval Service Reserve going aboard as extra crew when needed. Now, the Naval Service Reserve is the basket case of the Reserve. The command element of the Naval Service responsible for the Reserve engages with them in what can only be described as an erratic, highly questionable manner. Recruitment, training and the provision of necessary supports are areas of extreme concern. In terms of recruitment, the current batch of Naval Service Reserve applicants have recently been asked to complete Garda security vetting applications for the 3rd time. They were first asked to do this in January 2016, then again in June-July 2016, and now they have been asked to do this for a 3rd time. These are applicants who applied to join the Naval Service Reserve in late 2015 and who still have not been inducted into the organisation. It would not be hard to reverse the situation in the Naval Service Reserve, given the high level of expertise and qualifications present within the Reserve members of the organisation, but if Naval Service Management does not wish to repair and grow the Naval Service Reserve, then its fate is sealed. Sadly, the RDFRA must also report that even at the highest levels, meaningful engagement is lacking. Since the start of July 2016, RDFRA have forwarded 9 letters on matters of critical importance to the Office of the Minister with responsibility for defence. Aside from an acknowledgement of receipt reply received by RDFRA in each instance, no letters have been received to any of these communications. To sum up, the Reserve is a vital asset at the State's disposal. It is comprised of hard-working, enthusiastic and patriotic volunteers who undertake their reserve duties in a predominantly unpaid capacity. Crucially, this makes the reserve a very inexpensive force to maintain. To put it in context, the 2014 reserve pay bill equated to only 75% of the annual cost of private cleaners to clean Defence Forces buildings that year, while the 2015 reserve pay bill almost matched the Defence Forces 2015 natural gas bill. You would be very hard-pressed to find an organisation who would not be excited at the prospect of having 4,000 willing and enthusiastic volunteers who would predominantly work for free in their service. But the reserve is not just a collection of patriotic Irish men and women. We are doctors, engineers, IT experts, legal professionals, academics, entrepreneurs, business owners, tradespersons, civil servants and students. In essence, we come from all walks of life and provide the Defence Forces with a huge range of specialist skills. In fact, in 2016, 6 reservists, all with highly impressive IT backgrounds, revolutionised the communication systems that the Defence Forces were due to provide to the EU battle group then training in Germany. All that was required for the Defence Forces to be impressive on the international stage was for these 6 reservists to travel to Germany for a number of days to set up their equipment after transit, after which the permanent Defence Forces element of the battle group could operate the equipment and the reservists could travel home. However, because of legislation that states that only members of the permanent Defence Forces can serve overseas in operational roles, these reservists were prohibited from travelling to Germany, and the Defence Forces was subsequently unable to deploy the equipment that they had developed. This ban on letting reservists travel overseas, no matter how briefly, was even extended to a group of reservists who were invited to view British Army Reserve training procedures in Ballykindler, County Down in 2016. The invitation had to be rejected after the Department of Defence deemed this to be operational service overseas. Arguments that there is no sea between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland fell on deaf ears. We see no benefit to the continued existence of this policy, as it hampers the Defence Forces in the delivery of its operational targets. It is perhaps ironic that in the year in which the state commemorated the memory of a group of volunteer, patriotic men and women who were not professional soldiers, that the Irish Reserve Defence Forces should be so mishandled and mistreated, despite all of the added value that it provides to the state. In conclusion, those who should be ensuring that the reserve is maintained and grown as per the 2015 White Paper on Defence seem to care very little about the future of the force. And so we are here today in the hopes of improving the fortunes of this great and proud asset to the state before it is too late. Thank you, and I would now like to invite questions from members of the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richardson. I think you outlined very clearly there many areas that have to be of concern to us in regard to poor administrative practices, a reserve defence force in decline number-wise, and you even point out the threat to its very existence within the next 10 years. Well, I represent 2 of the southern Ulster counties, Cavan and Monaghan, for a considerable number of years, and I grew up in a border community. And I think on a number of occasions in this committee and in the Dáil chamber as well, I outlined the importance and the value that I have attached always to the Reserve Defence Forces. And I repeat it here again. I've seen many young people in particular who may have been in a vulnerable position in their lives, but whose participation and enrolment in the Reserve Defence Forces really turned around their lives to become top-class citizens working in the local community and working in the national interest as well. And I'm talking about young people who could have been targeted by paramilitary organisations and by other undesirables to bring them on the wrong path. And I have to emphasise again the role that the Reserve Defence Force have played in the lives of so many individuals and families. In our discussions the last day, I think it was at the estimates with Minister Keogh, I gathered from him at that time that you had a difficulty recruiting people. And he was indicating to us if we had ideas for recruitment, to give him some ideas for recruitment. I mentioned at that particular time, as many other members here put forward suggestions as well, I know that a lot of our colleges of further education run courses in security nowadays. And I was just indicating to him maybe they would be a cohort of young students that you could target who might be interested in enlisting. But the message that Minister Keogh was given to us was the people weren't interested. How do you generate interest? What you have said to me contrasts it contrasts sharply with what I gathered, the message that the Minister was giving to us. But again, as a representative of a border community, I emphasise the important role that the Reserve Defence Force have played and should be continuing to play. And I think as a committee we would be all very disturbed by the contents of your presentation today, because all of my colleagues here at previous meetings when we had the opportunity to discuss defence issues actually spoke very, very clearly in relation to the importance of the Reserve Defence Forces, and for us to support the force and to encourage as great a recruitment and participation as possible. Do you want to make? I'll take some other colleagues here, and maybe you'd respond to all questions together. Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan was first to indicate.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very interesting and did make for grim reading, these serious concerns. In my previous life as a secondary teacher, they used to come in and speak to the girls, and there was always great interest because of the way in which it was presented as to the benefits to them by getting involved, and I'm glad to say that some of them did. This was in Dublin. As I was listening to you, I was thinking to myself, there's obviously something wrong with the culture, and then you made that point yourself. So my question would be to elaborate on that a little bit, because you said there's a more positive engagement with military authorities and you don't see that with the Naval Reserve. So I'd just like to hear about that. And then the very few numbers who made it through, on what basis did they make it through and others were rejected? And my last question then, have you examples of international best practice in similar reserve forces, because we know the value, we know the benefit, but is there a procedure and a funding, a resource issue that other countries have that we could learn from? But there does seem to be a dumbing down from what you're saying here, and I think it's something that we can pursue.
Thanks, Deputy O'Sullivan. Deputy Chambers.
Thank you, Chairman. And I think that your support of the organisation can be in no doubt. You've spoken on many occasions as to the value of the Reserve Defence Forces in your own experience. And certainly I've agreed with you on all of those occasions, and you've spoken plenty of time, I'm sure, before I ever attended at this committee and in the chamber. As members will be aware, and as the panel will be aware, thank you, Eugene, Neil and John. I served with the Reserve Defence Forces for about 13 years, and myself and Neil actually served together and trained together for over many years. So I have first-hand experience of what the organisation can bring to a community and to an individual. And there's no doubt that as an organisation it helped to shape the person that I am today, and played a huge role in terms of my development as a young person from when I joined and all the way through my 20s and through college and everything like that. So, you know, I think that maybe the Defence Forces and certainly the Department don't fully appreciate the social value of the Reserve Defence Forces and the community value that it brings. And certainly the day that I attended at my local barracks for the official closing of that barracks and the removal of the PDF unit from there, we now retain a small outpost, but it is only a shadow of the former facility that it used to be in our town, right in the centre of Castlebar. And to see it gone, you know, it represents a huge loss to the community, and certainly it represents, I suppose, it highlights the disadvantage for people in that area, because they don't have access really to the military and to the army as much as they would have had in previous years. Certainly I think it is lost on many people and citizens as well, the huge voluntary nature of the organisation and the spirit of volunteerism that the Reserve represents. And as has been outlined very eloquently by Neil, you know, that the many hours of service that reservists give of their own free will without any remuneration, very little remuneration, very often at a huge personal cost to themselves, not just in terms of foregoing their wages or their salaries for their period of training, but in terms of having to purchase their own equipment. And I certainly have had personal experience of that, going on numerous training courses where I was not properly equipped by the Defence Forces to attend on that training and had to purchase my own equipment. I remember purchasing my own first pair of tactical boots because I wasn't provided with any. With the Reserve Defence Forces, and I was expected to go on the ground for 2 or 3 nights in barrack boots, which not only are they not suitable, but they do present a health and safety issue, and they're not proper protective equipment for the individual going on that exercise, and you will come back with problems with your feet coming off the ground. So now the only option open to me was to purchase my own, and I was very fortunate that I was able to do that. But there are many reservists that maybe financially cannot afford to do that, and it's totally unacceptable. And similarly, when as we mentioned, in terms of the lack of availability of warm clothing and what's provided to reservists, again, totally inadequate clothing provided in terms of dealing with colder temperatures. Also the issue, and it's a very, very real issue, Chairman, of pooling personal equipment. I too have put on a helmet, God knows how many times it was worn, probably never washed or cleaned, and you just got on with it, but it's not acceptable. and it certainly presents a health issue to those members having to put on that clothing that is not clean and is not fit for purpose. So these are all issues that the Minister certainly can address and address in the immediate future. And I would agree, Chairman, we spoke previously about it's an issue of resourcing and it's an issue of funding, and it's something that the Minister has to answer for. I have a number of questions, and Chairman, if I'm going on too long, I have no difficulty stepping out and coming back in at a later stage, but I will ask a number of questions. And just, I suppose, before moving on to questions, to again reiterate my unwavering support for the Reserve Defence Forces. I recognise the campaign underway to diminish the capacity of the Reserve, the unwillingness of the Department to step up to the plate in terms of adequately assisting you with recruitment, and I had to scoff at the idea that somehow we were having difficulties recruiting people. That is not the problem. We have had thousands of members apply to join our Reserve Defence Forces, and only a small fraction, I think over 5,000 applicants last year, less than 100 actually inducted. The problem was with the organisation, not with the Reserve, with the Department and with senior ranking members within the organisation that are actively putting up obstacles to allowing those members be inducted and recruited into the organisation. And it has been going on for many years. I have raised this several times with the Minister in the Chamber, through parliamentary questions, through priority questions. I have raised it here in this committee, and nothing is happening. So for the Minister to suggest that somehow the problem was with the organisation in attracting talent, it is far from the case. And this has been made very clear to him on several occasions, and he is failing miserably to actually address this issue properly. So just a number of questions, and Chairman, again, I'll step out, no problem, and come back in. Mr Richardson, if you could maybe discuss in more detail the issue of RDF pay. I think there are many aspects to that that are maybe not quite clear, and I think it would be of benefit to the committee to learn more about that. As part of the White Paper on Defence published in August 2015, there was a commitment that the views of RDFRA and comments would be sought on any matter concerning the implementation of that paper. So I would be interested to hear, have you been contacted for your views or comments on any aspect of the implementation of the White Paper concerning the RDF? I would also be interested to hear your views on what are the issues as you see them in terms of implementing that White Paper. Again, your views on how you feel the single force structure is working since that came in. I would also appreciate if you could offer a view as to why there was an underutilisation of training mandates last year, and what are the difficulties presenting to those currently enlisted as to why maybe they're not taking up those training mandates. Also, if you could maybe suggest to the committee how we can better support currently serving members within the RDF, and maybe some suggestions as to how we can retain those we already have, because clearly that's an issue as well, and that's actually an issue in the PDF also, but I think maybe the difficulties are maybe slightly different with the Reserve. Can you outline the issues as you see it surrounding the security clearance requirement? What's happening? What do you know? What can you tell the committee as to what the issues are there? I think I have a fairly good idea. I have been submitting questions both to the Department of Justice and to the Department of Defence in this. And Chairman, just for the committee's information, initially I was told by the Department of Defence that there was issues with security clearance at the Garda stage. I put a question down to the Minister for Justice asking for the times, the normal times for security clearance through An Garda Síochána. Approximately 6 weeks it takes to clear somebody. It can be up to 12, and we have people waiting over a year. So in my view, the issue is with the Department of Defence, not with the Department of Justice. Just as well, I know you've requested additional funding for the Reserve Defence Force Representative Association from the Department of Defence. I'd appreciate an update on that matter. I have, for the record, written to the Minister on this because I know you were having difficulties in getting a reply on that. I think you have fairly touched upon the personal protective equipment. I was going to ask about that, but I think you've pretty much covered that. And I'd be interested also to hear your views on the establishment of a specialist reserve. And I'm really glad, Mr Richardson, that you outlined the vast experience and expertise and knowledge available within the reserve. To think we only have over 2,000 effective members, and the amount of skills and people from different professions and trades across the board that we have access to. We're not even using this, which is phenomenal stuff altogether. But I would be appreciated if you could outline to the committee your views on the Specialist Reserve and the establishment of same. I think that's all my questions, Chairman.
Thanks, Deputy Chairman. Deputy Tony McLaughlin, then we'll go back to Mr Richardson and his colleagues.
Thanks very much indeed. And gentlemen, you're very, very welcome, and thank you very much for your submission there this morning, and also, you paint a very, very damning picture of where you're coming from in relation to your concerns, and I'd just like to know in relation to your budget. Perhaps you might give me some details on what type of funding that you're getting specifically, and also, I suppose, what roles do you believe the professionally qualified reserves members mentioned in the document will serve within the force, and what particular skills and professional qualifications are they seeking? I think perhaps maybe you might be able to give us, because you're right, Chairman. I was of the opinion when we last spoke about this, it was in relation to. I had a question there in relation to the Defence Force's plan to raise awareness and attract more recruits from counties where it is difficult, perhaps maybe at present, to recruit people. And what is your plans? And are you using social media in relation to attracting people? And I know, and in support of what the Chairman has said, the work that's been done by the Reserve Defence Services over the years, and I come from a constituency in Sligo, Leitrim, part of Cavan and Donegal, and I know certainly, and I applaud the work that you have been doing and your colleagues over many, many years. So perhaps you might just clarify some of those questions, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy McLaughlin. We'll take responses to those questions, and then we have 3 other members want to come in with further questions. Mr. Garrigan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just in relation to some of the points that you have made, and you quite correctly mentioned the social value of membership of the Reserve Defence Forces. However, we have taken the view, in light of the response by the military authorities, that they don't see any value to the social element whatsoever at all. We are looked at through the prism of military value exclusively. We do recognise that there is a great benefit to somebody who enlists and is trained, and it gives them a sense of purpose, and they learn how to operate in a military and a soldier-like fashion and discipline. And all these are very good features and something which is capitalised. In other jurisdictions, there was a mention there in relation to best practice elsewhere. And we, as a representative association, have made countless submissions, and we have made countless points in relation to comparators between ourselves and other European countries where the utilisation of the reserve is more effective in terms militarily, but also financially as well. If I want to move on then to the point in relation to culture, and addressing the issue of culture in a very large organisation such as the Defence Forces, it's a nebulous concept. Where we come to from it is based on our own experience, anecdotal evidence, and actually the formal evidence in terms of dealing with the issues themselves as they're presented to us. And we are limited in what we can do. There was mention in relation to some of the regulations. Defence Forces Regulations S7, for example, is that which covers us as a representative body. We are very constrained in what we can do and how we can assist our people. R5, for example, is the regulation that effectively covers how the reserve is run at a very high level. And there are some glaring requirements for updates and for, I suppose, amendments to be made to that, which we are waiting for literally for years and years. So the culture issue is something which has happened, and it has happened slowly over the last number of years. It exists in a state somewhere in the middle management of the Defence Forces. Neil has mentioned earlier on that the reception that we get when we deal with the general staff, so this is the top layer of management within the Defence Forces, is always polite, it's businesslike, and it's always positive. Definitely, we are told that there is a value that is recognised in the reserve, and as far as the general staff are concerned, they're doing all they can in order to try and facilitate and utilise us in a meaningful and effective way. However, quite simply, that doesn't happen on the ground. It doesn't actually happen. And the only place where we can identify where there is a breakdown in what we would refer to as the commander's intentions is somewhere in the middle echelons. It falls apart. And we can probably point to the fact that there are no targets set for unit commanders which specifically call out utilisation or training of reserve elements underneath their control. And this is a problem, because if there are no targets effectively set at that level, then there are no sanction for failing to meet such targets. There was, and I have to call it out, that there was an effort to introduce what's called key performance indicators, or known as KPIs, within the Defence Forces, and that was really just a measure of, it was counting the number of man days, counting how many people were in, how many people were out. It didn't really go to address, and it didn't seek to implement improvements, which is what we're seeking with the utilisation of the reserve. The culture itself manifests itself, if you look at a very broad organisation with so many people in it, invariably you will find that there will be some areas which will be hot spots and some areas will be cold spots, if I can refer to it as that. Some areas, it has to be recognised, where we have people within the Defence Forces who are very pro-reserve. And we're very sympathetic to these individuals because they recognise the value. In some cases, frequently, these people, these commanders and these people who are employed in the Defence Forces have been members of the reserve themselves, and they're great advocates for us. But they're really swimming against the current. Because if the rest of the organisation doesn't support them in their attempts to utilise us properly, it's a major problem. And I have to call that out and recognise the fact that it's not a universal condemnation of culture within the Defence Forces. However, there are areas where we can see that we are recognised as nothing only, we represent a risk to someone's career. That the safest thing to do in relation to the reserve under your command is do nothing with them. Therefore, they can't hurt you, they can't do any harm. So there is no specific target set for our utilisation. We are dismayed, obviously, that the Defence Forces has issues with the processing of items like security clearances. We have brought this up several times before. We have asked what the solution is to it. Simple things. If you come from a business background, you'll understand how business processes work. You understand that documentation needs to be tracked through various stages, where it's approved, where it goes, who's responsible and who's accountable for it. There seems to be an unwillingness or an inability to provide for these types of processes, despite the fact that we have any number of experts in the service of the reserve who could do this and would be happy to do it. It's quite convenient to blame on Garda Síochána and the Garda Vetting Unit, but in my experience in other areas, I can tell you that the Garda Vetting Unit, and certainly since the advent of e-vetting, is actually quite effective and is quite efficient at making returns. So you have to ask, what is it that's actually happening? Anecdotally, we hear that all the applications come in, they literally might sit on somebody's desk, but because there is no sanction for failing to deal with this, there is no incentive for anyone to deal with it. So there's where there's a breakdown in the procedure. There's where the culture manifests itself. So, again, I could speak probably for the rest of the day in relation to the culture. I don't want to blanketly condemn people in the Permanent Defence Forces, because that would be unfair, and it simply isn't the case. There are some. Sadly, they're in the minority, people who bend over backwards to help us, and we're hugely appreciative of that. In relation to recruitment, again, I'd have to echo the point in relation to saying that there's a failure to recruit people, that somehow because people do not want to join the reserve. There are literally thousands of people. If any other organisation had a return rate of less than 1% for a campaign for recruitment, you would have to ask very serious questions of what's gone wrong. At a very high level, at an organisational level, does the organisation possess the intention or the will to address these issues? And we can only deduce from that that there is no such will. We can only come to the conclusion that all things considered, including recruitment, including the way that we have constant difficulties, we're fighting with the bureaucracy, right, which is, military bureaucracy is something to behold, in terms of getting people paid, in terms of people getting their man-day allowances, in terms of getting personal protective equipment, all things which would be very standard in industry or in enterprise in civilian life. And of course, we would have, if it was in a civilian context, we would have access to the WRC and the like. So these issues, we believe, because there's no sanction, they're allowed to happen again and again and again. The specialist reserve, that was an element that was mentioned as well. We, at the time of the production of the white paper, the former minister did invite us to participate in part of the process there, and we willingly did, and we made our submissions and we engaged as fully as we could. And our view at the time was, when the white paper was published, that we endorsed it. There were some areas contained within the white paper which it could be interpreted a number of ways, but we chose as a representative organisation to embrace it and to say, yes, this is a good thing, this is the way forward. And we took any ambiguity which arose from that document to say, we will take it on face value, and we will take the verbal assurances that we got, both from the Department, from the then Minister and the military authorities as well, that it all would work out in our favour, because they recognised our value, and they would seek to use us as best they possibly could, notwithstanding the challenges in relation to employer engagement and a few other issues with that. And we welcomed that. We recognised that the white paper was an unfinished process, that there were wrinkles that would have to be ironed out of it, but we were there to help and assist. And what we found is that we get invited to the project meetings almost as an afterthought, that we found that the rest of the participants and the stakeholders have already advanced, have already been speaking to each other. So we're pushed to the back of the queue again. It's very disheartening, but it's also quite unfair as well, because we have a lot to offer and we have a lot to contribute. And bearing in mind our only motivation here is to serve the state, and to do so, for the most part, for free. So we are a resource that we're not being used, and it beggars belief that the military authorities and the department can't recognise that and use us for what we can provide. Any other country would be crying out for people knocking on the door to try and join up.
Thanks very much, Mr Gargan. Senator McFadden.
Thank you, Chair. Gentlemen, you're very welcome this morning, and I'm personally delighted to have this opportunity to hear from you firsthand the situation that you find yourselves in, and I'm very disappointed when I read it. I was one of only 2 actual Oireachtas members who attended the symposium in Farmley on the day in 2015, and I was very enthusiastic about the white paper myself, as I think everybody was, and there was a lot of talk about talking up the Defence Forces over the next 10 years, and that included, as far as I was concerned, the reserves. So I'm very disappointed to hear how you're feeling. And at the time I thought it was very much, as you said yourself, pro-reserve. A lot has been said here this morning already and asked already, some of the stuff that I wanted to ask you. And I suppose, you know, the benefits that there is to the community that we all know about. I know myself, coming from Athlone, and we having a barracks in Athlone, and the difficulties we had with flooding last year, and how important it was to us that we had the volunteerism that we did have. And that's not only that's fantastic to a community, but the personal benefits that there are to the reserves themselves is second to none. People that come out of the reserves or stay in them, indeed, have discipline and structure in their lives, and it's very beneficial. And that, in turn, I suppose, comes back into the community as a benefit. Just there's a few questions I had. One of the things you talked about, the end of gratuity, and you talk about your normal reserve pay. Can you just tell us a little bit about those? And is there a possibility that that could be standardised as part of a payroll run and done with the permanent defence forces, so that it is standardised and people can rely on it? Because you can't tell your mortgage holder that, you know, I might get paid in a couple of weeks' time. So is there a way that you could standardise pay for the reserves, and it could be included in a payroll run with the permanent members? And the other question I think Deputy McLaughlin asked, I think, was, you know, what kind of funding do you get, and what kind of admin support do you get, you know, that could help you with it? And if there were 3 things that we could do as a committee here today, or 3 things we could look for you as a committee here today, what would those 3 things be that could help you and help your members? I think that's it, because everything else has been covered. And just to thank you and your members for your service to the state. It doesn't go missed by any of the rest of us, apart from, you know, you get that feeling. But we all know here that the wonderful work you do, and we're grateful to you. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator McFadden. Senator Lawless.
Thank you, gentlemen. You know, the National Guard or National Reserves in most countries, as far as I can see, work hand in hand with the regular defence forces. This is a very, very damning report. I mean, it's really disturbing, so it is, to think that our reserves will be treated with such contempt. And that's, I mean, I read that with you when you were giving your presentation there. Wow, I said, I didn't realise this was going on at all in the reserve forces. But there seems to be, why is there this type of contempt? And that's, reading that report, that's what I took out of this. Very disturbing, so it is. Very disturbing.
Thank you very much, Senator Lawless. Deputy Sean Barrett.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Chairman, to follow on from what Senator Lawless has just said, I'm 36 years since I was elected to this House, and the most damning report I've ever received from anybody, ever, in 36 years. I'm also ashamed of the fact that I was once a Minister for Defence, back in the 90s, when the Defence Reserve was always a very important aspect of the overall structure. Now, there's no point in following on condemning what already been said. What I'm going to propose to you is that we send the exact copy of this, of Mr. Richardson's address, to the Minister for Defence and to the Chief of Staff from this committee. And we ask for comments on the points raised, and we also ask that they attend before this committee to answer these charges that are contained in the report. There's no point in having a meeting where we can listen to people expressing their disappointment and their concern. What I'm anxious about is to rectify this. And the only way I can think of it, part of this committee, is to suggest what I have suggested, and I hope that the committee would support me. But I think it's important that this be brought out into the open and that people attend here to answer these charges. And, and then we can take a decision as to how we go about making a recommendation as to how these changes should be made. But as I said, like Senator Lawless, I'm deeply disappointed that this feeling is there, and the very serious allegations have been made, and they should be fully investigated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Barrett. I would fully concur with your proposal, and I'm sure we would have unanimous agreement from the committee that we act according to the proposal that you have made. We can assure our visitors a deputation here today. And just my concluding remark, and I'll ask you to respond to the various issues that have been raised in the last group of questions. You mentioned that the person who was on a social welfare payment goes off it for the week or two that they go into training, and then by pure bad administration and lack of interest, that person then doesn't get their payment for the week. There's a delay in getting back on their social welfare. Like, the officials who were responsible for that maladministration, their weekly cheque was going in by electronic transmission into their bank account each week. And it's appalling that people on low incomes should be left in that situation. And you mentioned Christmas. Any week of the year is not acceptable. If a person does community public service, goes off their low enough income of social welfare or whatever, and then there's a delay in having the payment made to them, that's appalling. It's not acceptable in any walk of life, so it's not. And at whatever level that's allowed within the department or within the Defence Forces, it's not acceptable. Absolutely not. Because those people were paid that week themselves, the people who are responsible for other people not getting their weekly remuneration. The department said to us in a briefing note that the allocation for paid training in 2016 was 2.15 million, and that there was only a drawdown of 1.568 million, leaving $500,000 not drawn down. Now, that was giving us the impression that actually the expenditure that's allocated isn't even being drawn down. So, and then one other item that was referred to in the department briefing was that the delay in recruitment to the Reserve Defence Forces may be attributed to some extent to the pause that was in recruitment that was caused by the emphasis being placed on recruitment to the permanent Defence Forces. Now, that seems to me a very lame duck excuse as well. If there's an interest in recruiting people, you process the applications, you go through the necessary processes, security clearance, all of that, and none of us would condone not following processes properly. But again, what every one of my colleagues said here at the committee, your report is very disturbing. And as an Oireachtas, we don't want to see the Reserve Defence Forces go into oblivion. We want to stand by them, we want to support them, and we want numbers growing again. And as you said, it's very disheartening for members if they know there's not the same high reputational status attached to them in their community and among the people in their own community that there was in the past. The least that can be done is to restore that reputation, the well-deserved and well-earned good reputation over the years.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just make 2 points on that. In the past, we have often been criticised that, is the interest there for people joining the reserve? And I think the figures speak for themselves. In 2014, 4,800 applicants. A year later, 5,800 applicants, and nearly doubling the amount of female applicants in that time. They represent 2 12-month recruitment periods where we saw applications increase online by 1,000, yet the recruitment figures of those who were successful went from 341 down to approximately 60. So that's not for lack of interest, it's for lack of the Defence Forces facilitating that recruitment. And just on the figures of pay used and man days utilised, yes, we utilised about 55% of our pay budget last year. That's all we utilised. But what's never really spoken about is the fact that at 28 paid days per year, when a reservist hits that level, there is rigorous control measures in place to ensure that exceeding that number of paid days per year is a very, very difficult process, and in actual fact sometimes can be an impossible process. So if there is a sort of a glass ceiling placed on how many paid days a reservist can avail of each year, it's not surprising that our budget, our ability to utilise that pay budget for training's sake and for service is kept artificially low. So we end up only utilising 55% of our pay budget because we can't get any more pay. The budget allocation is there, but it's not being provided to us. So that's where, again, we're hitting sort of a glass ceiling at that point. So something to be investigated.
Thank you very much. Is everybody happy? And we'll work on the proposal of Deputy Sean Barrett. Has unanimous agreement of the committee that we ask the Minister to appear along with the Chief of Staff. Deputy Chambers?
The reports will be sent to both the Chief of Staff and to the...
That will be sent this afternoon to both of them. So it will. Yeah. Deputy Chambers?
Yeah, Chairman, I just want to join with Deputy Barrett's very sensible and reasonable suggestion that the report be forwarded, comments be sought, and those responsible appear before us as an Oireachtas committee to answer those charges. I think it's a very sensible approach. And I'm really heartened by the response around the table from all of us that we're appalled and disgusted at the way you've been treated, at the way the organisation has been treated, and there is no doubt that there will be no organisation left in 5 to 10 years if we continue on this trajectory. And I think, Chairman, that needs to be made clear in the letter to the Minister that this is an immediate concern and not one to be kicked down the road as it has been done over the last number of years. He needs to answer for this in the next number of weeks, not in the next number of years.
Yes, and also the transcript of today's proceedings will ensure that when they're available, that they're brought to the Minister. We forward them to the Minister for his attention, as well as to the Chief of Staff. Mr. Garrigan.
Mr. Chairman, just further on comment from Deputy Chambers there, referring, and it's by no means not a direct criticism, but saying that we won't be in existence in 5 or 10 years based on the current trends. I would argue that it's actually far more urgent than that you could probably express it in terms of months. And the reason for this is that the capability intrinsic to reserve elements is withering. We are losing the ability to be able to train personnel purely because we haven't had a pipeline of new volunteers that have been inducted into the Defence Force, into the reserve. So elements that were established in order to train and to utilise them, because basically we were all about training and having a readiness state available to the Defence Forces. If we haven't had that throughput, these are all perishable skills. So I would argue that it is absolutely urgent, and I would think my own concern is that I would think that we're in peril at this point in time, and it would be difficult to see us in existence in 2 years' time if immediate actions aren't taken.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Garrigan. Could I just assure you and your colleagues who are here with us in the public gallery as well, and your colleagues within the organisation, please assure them of the interests of the committee members here and of our committee, and we will be proactive on this particular issue. We will do all we can to assist you. And again, a sincere thanks to you for what is a very important presentation, but one that really gives real cause for concern to us. Thank you very much. B of today's meeting is meeting with Senator Robbie Gallagher regarding the increasing workload on the passport service due to increased numbers of inquiries and requests for passports, particularly following Britain's decision to leave the European Union. I now call on Senator Gallagher to make his opening remarks, and following this we can have questions and answers and discussion on this very important issue. Mr. Chairman. Senator Gallagher, we're in public session, so you're very welcome.